Marcus Ashford stood in his penthouse office, Manhattan glittering below him like a kingdom he'd conquered. At 62, he'd built an empire from nothing, turning a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth billions. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cream-colored envelope, forwarded by his lawyer with a note that simply read, "You need to see this." Inside was a letter from Grace Henderson, a woman he hadn't thought about in nearly 2 decades. The handwriting was shaky, the words direct. She was dying, and she wanted him to meet their daughter. Their daughter. The words felt foreign, almost absurd. He'd walked away from that relationship when Grace told him she was pregnant, choosing his ambitions over fatherhood. He'd been 25, hungry, desperate to prove himself. A child would have destroyed everything he was building. He'd sent money monthly for years through his lawyer, never asking questions, never wanting updates. It was easier that way, cleaner. Now Grace was asking him to visit, to meet 18-year-old Emma before it was too late. Marcus crumpled the letter, then smoothed it out again. He'd built skyscrapers, negotiated with world leaders, made decisions affecting thousands of employees. But this simple request terrified him more than any boardroom battle ever had. What could he possibly say to a daughter who'd grown up without him? What right did he have to walk into her life now? Yet something gnawed at him, something deeper than guilt. Perhaps it was mortality whispering in his ear, reminding him that empires crumble but family endures. He called his assistant, canceled his meetings for the week, and booked a flight to the small Oregon town where Grace had raised their daughter. As his private jet lifted off the next morning, Marcus stared out at the clouds, wondering if he was flying toward redemption or just another failure he couldn't buy his way out of. Willow Creek, Oregon was everything Marcus had spent his life escaping. The town had one main street, a handful of shops with hand-painted signs, and a pace of life that seemed to belong to a different century. His driver navigated the rented sedan past a hardware store, a diner with checkered curtains, and a small library that looked like it had been built in the 1950s. People noticed the expensive car, turning to stare with undisguised curiosity. Marcus felt exposed, uncomfortable in his tailored suit among pickup trucks and worn jeans. He'd grown up in a town not unlike this one in rural Pennsylvania, clawing his way out through scholarships and sheer determination. Returning to this kind of place felt like traveling backward through time, confronting the poverty and limitation he'd fought so hard to leave behind. The GPS directed him to Maple Street, a modest neighborhood where small houses sat on generous lots, their yards filled with swing sets and vegetable gardens. Number 42 was a pale blue cottage with white trim, its paint slightly faded but lovingly maintained. Flower boxes overflowed with late summer blooms, and a wooden sign near the door read Henderson in cheerful cursive. Marcus sat in the car for 10 minutes, gathering courage he didn't know he needed. Through his years of business, he'd trained himself to walk into any room with confidence, to dominate any negotiation. But this wasn't a boardroom, and the stakes were infinitely higher than any deal he'd ever made. Finally, he stepped out, straightening his tie, and walked up the brick pathway. Before he could knock, the door opened. A woman who must have been in her mid-40s stood there, her face gaunt but still beautiful, eyes that had once sparkled with youth now carrying the weight of illness and hardship. "Marcus," Grace said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came." Grace led Marcus into a living room that was small but immaculate, filled with second-hand furniture that had been carefully maintained and photographs that chronicled a life he'd never been part of. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, and Marcus could see the illness ravaging her body. They sat on a worn sofa, an awkward silence stretching between them until Grace finally spoke. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange," she began, folding her hands in her lap. "I didn't contact you for forgiveness or even understanding. I contacted you because Emma deserves to know her father before I'm gone, and you deserve to know what an extraordinary person she's become despite your absence." The words stung, but Marcus accepted them. Grace explained that she'd been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 6 months ago, that the treatments had failed, and that she had perhaps weeks left. She'd never remarried, never introduced Emma to potential father figures because she couldn't bear to risk another abandonment. Instead, she'd worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to give their daughter everything she could. Emma knows about you, Grace continued, her voice stronger now. I never lied to her. I told her that her father was a man with big dreams who wasn't ready to be a parent, that you sent money but wanted no other connection. She's angry about that, Marcus. She's built walls around that anger for years. Marcus felt something crumble inside his chest. What can I possibly say to her? How do I explain choosing money and success over my own child? Grace's expression softened slightly. I don't know if you can explain it in a way that will satisfy her. But Emma is brilliant, compassionate, and stronger than both of us. She's graduating high school this year with a full scholarship to MIT. She's everything I could have hoped for and nothing I could have expected. She paused, reaching for a glass of water with trembling hands. She doesn't know you're here. I wanted to talk to you first, to see if you'd actually come, to prepare you for what you're about to see. Grace led Marcus through the small house to a detached garage in the backyard. This is Emma's space, she explained as they approached. I gave it to her 3 years ago when her projects outgrew her bedroom. Whatever you're expecting, set it aside. She knocked on the door and a voice called out, "Come in." Marcus stepped inside and froze. The garage had been transformed into a sophisticated workshop and laboratory. One wall held shelves packed with electronics, circuit boards, and components organized with meticulous precision. Another featured a workbench with soldering equipment, 3D printers, and tools. Marcus couldn't identify. A large whiteboard covered in equations and diagrams dominated the back wall. But what captured his attention was the girl hunched over a laptop at a central work table, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt with some coding joke he didn't understand. She looked up, and Marcus saw his own eyes staring back at him from a face that was unmistakably Grace's. "Emma," Grace said gently, "this is your father, Marcus Ashford." Emma's expression didn't change. She studied him with an intensity that made Marcus feel like a specimen under a microscope. "So, you finally decided to show up," she said flatly, turning back to her laptop. "Only took 18 years and Mom dying for you to find the time." The words were brutal in their honesty. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing anything he said would sound like an excuse. He looked around the workshop instead, genuinely curious. "What are you working on?" Emma's fingers paused on the keyboard. For a moment, he thought she'd ignore him, but then she sighed. A low-cost water filtration system for developing countries. Using solar power and locally sourced materials. I'm competing in the Intel International Science Fair next month. She gestured to a prototype on the nearby bench, an elegant combination of simple materials and sophisticated engineering. Marcus stepped closer, examining the device. His tech background allowed him to appreciate the innovation, the clever problem-solving evident in every component. Marcus spent the next hour listening as Emma, despite her initial hostility, couldn't resist explaining her work. It was clear she'd inherited his analytical mind and Grace's compassionate heart, creating something neither of them alone could have produced. She showed him 3 other projects: an affordable prosthetic hand she designed for children in war-torn regions, an app connecting food banks with restaurants to reduce waste, and an AI-assisted tutoring program for rural schools. Each project solved real problems for people with limited resources. As Emma talked, her walls lowered incrementally. Marcus recognized something in her presentation style, the same passion he felt when discussing his early innovations. But where his work had focused on profit and market domination, hers centered entirely on human impact. "Why these projects?" Marcus asked. "You could be working on commercial applications, things that would make you wealthy." Emma's eyes hardened again. "Is that what you think matters? Getting rich?" She gestured around the modest workshop. "Mom worked herself to exhaustion while you sent checks and pretended that was parenting. Money doesn't make you a good person, Mr. Ashford. It just makes you a person with money." The criticism landed hard, but Marcus pressed on. "That's not what I meant. Your intelligence could take you anywhere, do anything. I'm asking why you chose this particular path." Emma was quiet for a moment, then spoke more softly. Because I know what it's like to have nothing. To watch your mom choose between medication and groceries, to wear secondhand clothes and pretend you don't care when other kids make fun of you. I know what it's like to have a parent who thinks money is a substitute for presents. She met his eyes directly. I'm choosing to use whatever gifts I have to help people who can't help themselves. Maybe if you'd been around, I would have learned to value different things. I guess I should thank you for your absence. Marcus felt the weight of those words settle on him like a physical burden, heavier than any failure he'd experienced in business. Over the following days, Marcus returned to the workshop daily. Grace encouraged it despite Emma's protests, insisting that Marcus had come all this way and deserved a chance, however small, to know his daughter. The visits were awkward at first, filled with long silences and careful conversation. But Marcus had built an empire on persistence, and he applied that same determination to breaking through Emma's defenses. He began by doing rather than talking. When Emma struggled with a circuit board that wasn't cooperating, Marcus asked if he could look at it. His early career had involved hands-on engineering before he'd moved into executive roles, and those skills hadn't entirely faded. Together, they identified a faulty capacitor and corrected the design. Emma didn't thank him, but she didn't tell him to leave either. Marcus started arriving with coffee from the local diner, learning Emma preferred it black with 2 sugars. He brought technical journals he thought she'd find interesting, listened more than he spoke, and slowly began sharing stories from his own early days as an engineer and entrepreneur. He told her about the failures, the countless prototypes that didn't work, the investors who laughed him out of their offices. Emma listened, sometimes pretending she wasn't interested, but unable to hide her curiosity entirely. One afternoon, Emma showed him a problem she couldn't solve in her water filtration design. The solar panels weren't generating sufficient power for the purification process she'd envisioned. Marcus studied the schematics, his mind working through the physics and engineering constraints. What if you're approaching it backward, he suggested carefully. Instead of trying to power your ideal process, what if you redesign the process around the available power? They spent 6 hours that day sketching alternatives, debating approaches, calculating efficiencies. Emma challenged every one of his assumptions, but she was thinking alongside him, now rather than against him. When they finally cracked the problem with a clever use of passive filtration combined with periodic UV pulses, Emma actually smiled. It was brief, quickly suppressed, but Marcus saw it and felt something unfamiliar warm in his chest. Grace's condition deteriorated rapidly. The woman who'd opened the door to Marcus just days ago now spent most of her time in bed, her body surrendering to the cancer despite her fierce will. Emma balanced her time between her workshop and her mother's bedside, and Marcus found himself helping in ways he'd never imagined. He cooked meals from recipes Grace directed from her room, cleaned the house, handled the medical equipment with the same careful precision he once applied to corporate documents. One evening, as Emma sat with Grace, Marcus overheard their conversation from the hallway where he was sorting medications. "Why did you ask him to come?" Emma asked her mother, her voice thick with emotion. "You know I don't need him. We've done fine without him all these years." Grace's response was barely audible. "Because I won't be here, sweetheart, and you shouldn't be alone. Because despite everything, he's your father, and people can change. Because I see how you look at each other in that workshop, and I see him finally understanding what matters." Emma was crying now. "I don't want you to go, Mom. I don't want to forgive him. I don't want any of this." "I know, baby. I know." Later that night, Marcus sat alone in the small guest room where he'd been staying, a room that had probably been Emma's when she was younger based on the faded star stickers still visible on the ceiling. He'd called his office only once since arriving, delegating everything to his executives. The urgent emails and board meetings that had once consumed every thought now seemed distant and trivial. He thought about his empire, the gleaming headquarters, the powerful connections and prestigious awards. None of it felt as meaningful as the last few days spent in this workshop with a daughter who barely tolerated him, fixing a water filter for people he'd never meet. At 2 a.m, he heard movement downstairs. He found Emma in the kitchen, making tea with shaking hands, her face blotchy from crying. Without speaking, Marcus took over, finishing the tea and guiding her to the couch. They sat in silence for a long time before Emma finally spoke. "I'm not ready to lose her." Marcus had never been good with emotions, had built his career on logic and strategy, but sitting in the dim living room with his broken-hearted daughter, he found words he didn't know he possessed. "Neither am I," he said quietly. "And I have no right to grieve her after abandoning both of you. But I am. She's the woman I was too stupid and selfish to appreciate when I had the chance." Emma looked at him, her eyes red and searching. "Why did you leave? Really? I've heard Mom's version, but I want to hear yours. No corporate spin, no PR. Just the truth." Marcus took a deep breath. This was the conversation he'd been dreading and knew was inevitable. "I was terrified," he began, and the admission felt like releasing pressure he'd carried for decades. "I grew up poor, watching my father drink away every paycheck, watching my mother work herself into an early grave. I was desperate to escape that, to prove I was worth something. When Grace told me she was pregnant, all I could see was my future collapsing, turning into my parents' life." He stared at his hands, expensive watch catching the lamplight. "I told myself I was doing the right thing by sending money, that financial support was what mattered. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid that if I stayed, I'd fail you both. That I'd turn into my father, bitter and broken. So I ran toward success as hard as I could, convincing myself that building an empire was more important than being a father." Emma listened, her expression unreadable. "Did it work? Did your empire make you happy?" The question cut through every rationalization Marcus had constructed over 18 years. "No," he admitted. "I've had 3 marriages that ended because I couldn't be present, couldn't be vulnerable. I have business associates, but no real friends. I've stood on stages receiving awards in rooms full of people and felt completely alone." He turned to face Emma directly. "I won't insult you by saying I wish I'd made different choices, because wishes are cheap. I made my choices, and they were wrong. They were selfish and cowardly, and you paid the price for my fear." Grace died on a Tuesday morning as autumn rain tapped against the windows. Emma held one hand while Marcus held the other, and in those final moments, Grace looked between them with something that might have been peace or simply exhaustion. Her last words were for Emma. "Be brilliant, baby. Be brave. Be kind." The funeral was small, attended by neighbors, teachers, and former co-workers who spoke of Grace's generosity despite having so little. Marcus paid for everything, but insisted on keeping it simple, respecting how Grace had lived. He watched Emma deliver a eulogy that was beautiful and heartbreaking, celebrating a mother who'd sacrificed everything and never complained. In the days following, Marcus handled the logistics that grief makes impossible: insurance claims, estate matters, the mundane bureaucracy of death. Emma moved through the house like a ghost, sometimes working in her workshop for hours, other times simply sitting in Grace's chair, staring at nothing. 1 week after the funeral, Marcus found Emma in the workshop, staring at her water filtration project. "I'm supposed to present this at the science fair in 3 weeks, she said flatly. "I don't know if I can do it without her." Marcus sat down beside her. "Your mother told me once that you were stronger than both of us combined. I think she was right." Emma's face crumpled. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm drowning." For the first time, she turned to Marcus and let him hold her while she sobbed. They sat like that for over an hour, and when Emma finally pulled away, something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "You'll go back to your company, your life. I'll finish high school, go to MIT. We'll probably never see each other again." Marcus had been thinking about exactly this question, and his answer surprised even himself. What if it didn't have to be that way? What if we figured out how to be a family, even this late, even this broken? 3 months later, Marcus stood in Emma's workshop, now relocated to a much larger space adjacent to his company's research facility in Portland. He'd sold the Manhattan penthouse, promoted his CFO to CEO, and restructured his role to focus on a new division, the Grace Henderson Foundation, dedicated to funding young inventors solving problems for underserved communities. Emma had initially refused his help, insisted on maintaining her independence. But Marcus had learned patience. He didn't offer money, he offered resources. Lab equipment, connections to manufacturers who could help scale her designs, mentorship from engineers who understood her vision. Slowly, Emma had accepted, setting strict boundaries that Marcus respected absolutely. She'd attend MIT as planned, spending summers working with the foundation. She called him Marcus, not Dad, and he didn't push for more. They had lunch every Sunday, sometimes talking about projects, sometimes eating in comfortable silence. The water filtration system had won the Intel International Science Fair, but more importantly, it was now being produced and distributed to communities in East Africa. Emma's prosthetic design was in beta testing with 3 NGOs. Her food bank app had been adopted by 15 cities. Marcus had finally learned what Grace tried to tell him 18 years ago, that legacy wasn't measured in stock prices or corporate valuations, but in impact that outlived you. Emma would never fully forgive his absence, and he would carry that failure forever. But they were building something new from the wreckage of what should have been. On Emma's 19th birthday, she found a gift on her workbench, a framed photo of Grace in her 20s, laughing at something off-camera, beautiful and full of life. Next to it was a note in Marcus's handwriting. She was brilliant, brave, and kind, just like her daughter. Thank you for giving me a chance to learn what matters. Marcus. That evening, Emma called him for the first time without prompting, just to talk. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, Marcus had learned, beginnings are everything.